Hi everyone, my name is Emily and I am an alcoholic. Welcome to the Design for Living Big Book Study. And Elizabeth.
I'm Elizabeth, alcoholic.
All right, we are on chapter 4, We Agnostics, at the bottom of page 44. Do you want to start?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah, okay. All right. This is one of my favorite paragraphs. If a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. But we found that such codes and philosophies did not save us no matter how much we tried. We could wish to be moral. We could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power wasn't there. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. Lack of power, that was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. But where and how are we to find this power? And I think so. I'm going to go ahead and admit that the first 14 years, I didn't read this chapter, never even read it. No, because I thought agnostic meant atheist. Of course, I didn't ask anybody, but I was also, living in the land of open discussion meetings and therapy. And when I found my big book sponsor and I read this paragraph, and I saw that mere code of morals. I mean, I was one of those people that made lists all the time, especially when I was young and in my 20s. I was writing down lists of things about how I was going to improve myself, my life, and all this stuff, right? And it never, and it would work for only so long, you know. And as long as it worked, I'm not looking for your power. I have my own power, but I had no idea. I didn't even know. I didn't know I was using my own power because for as long as it worked, but then just like when I drank, I always had an excuse for when it didn't work. You know, it's like it was your fault or it was because I didn't do this right. And I would make excuses for myself to always end up thinking that I had the power, right? I have the power to change this, make it better, improve it. And when you come from, when I got into AA in 1988 and I'm with these people that are all in therapy and reading self-help books, that's the message you're getting. If you keep trying, just work on this, work on that. I'm going to work on my defects of character. Today, I'm a one paragraph 6 and 7, honey, and I'll tell you why when we get there. Okay. This is about living life, and then my defects and my old character become really uncomfortable and doesn't work anymore. It says no matter how much we tried, right? And I kept trying and I kept trying. And as long as I thought I had the power, or I didn't notice that I didn't have the power. And that's where my ego exists in the subconscious, like Dr. Harry Tivo talks about. And it's not letting me see this, right? It's Jen's fault, or it's Emily's fault, or it's Elbel's fault, right? It's definitely not me, right? Or maybe it is me, and I'll just have to try better next time, you know? So I didn't see this. I also got here, like I said earlier, I'm on page 32. I think I got here in time. I was able to stay dry without a spiritual experience for many years of my recovery. Um, that's not true today. I know that for sure because of what I've gone through in the last few years. I know for sure that I have to live this way of life 100%. The pain of not doing it is way too great. So I'm really grateful that I know that today. Thank God. And I always tell people in AA, if what you're doing is working for you, because we see these little self-will run riots and they seem to be happy. They're running around running their lives, right? I did it. I don't hold that against anybody. Go for it. But if that stops working to keep you sober, then you might need that spiritual experience, and you might need to learn how to live a spiritual way of life and turn to a power that's not you, which I've learned how to do now. And I love that. We had to find a power by which we could live. My sponsor comes from the Fellowship of the Spirit. She said that is the number one thing you're here to do, period. Develop a relationship with higher power. And she said, I'm not your God. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I don't know what experiences your God needs you to have. This is between you and a higher power. And her most common quote was either you're not trusting God or pray and ask God. Those are the two things you could guarantee she would say to me if I had a problem or a question. She'd say you're not trusting God, or she'd say pray and ask God. Go ahead, Emily.
Excuse me. There really isn't too much more to add, honestly, but yeah, just when I was running my life on self-will. I was just not able to manage my life. Um, in general, I had consequences pile up from when I was trying to run my life on self-will, and I was just not very successful. I didn't really have much to add, but I can read. Well, that's exactly what this book is about. We're on page 45. Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which would solve your problem. That means you have written a book which we believe to be a spiritual, as well as moral. It means, of course, that you are going to talk about God. Here, difficulty arises with agnostics. Many times we talk to a new man and watch his hope rise as we discuss his alcoholic problems and explain our fellowship. His face falls when we speak of spiritual matters, especially when we mention God, for we have reopened a subject which our man thought he had neatly evaded or entirely ignored. Um, Yeah, when I first came in, I always thought this was like a religious program, but it's not. It says time and time again that in the book it is a spiritual program, and I'm just glad that is because I was forced to go to like church and Christian schools and all that growing up, and I just was not too fond of all that stuff, and then of course my dad. He's Catholic, and then my mom, she just whatever she thinks she is, and I'm just glad that we are able to believe in whatever we feel like believing in, and it doesn't matter, what it is, or any of that. But I like this chapter just because it um reiterates the importance of it. It doesn't have to be, a specific religion or any of that. It's just spiritual. So that's all I have for that paragraph.
Thanks. I don't have much more, but I do like where it says which will solve your problem. In step two, I missed that portion where it says that what does it say? Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves. Really, guys? I'm sorry. I thought it said believe in, not believe that. Right. So here it is again saying that a power greater than myself will solve your problem. And something I didn't notice, but I underlined in 2023, I like to date my underlines sometimes in my book. It says we believe to be spiritual as well as moral. And, it's interesting because, there's lists of virtues. Some people think they're principles, they're virtues. The principles are the steps. But you see like honesty, responsibility, surrender, all this stuff, selflessness, I don't know, there's different lists. And, you know, I heard a really great quote that said, when I show up and do the work, God will meet me halfway. And
Mhm.
some people don't like fake it till you make it, but when I tried, y'all are often here. I don't want to, I don't want to be nice to people that are mean to me. That ego part of me does not want to do that, but AA asks me to, right? When I do that, I have an experience, I have a change. So that is following something that is moral, right? And it's to be kind. So anyway, I just noticed that. So I thought that was kind of cool to point out. When I try to live a moral life, I find that God shows up and helps me when I'm trying to do the right thing. And you can look up the four absolutes too, and those are pretty moral.
Mhm.
Okay, we know how he feels. We have shared his honest doubt and prejudice. Some of us have been violently anti-religious. To others, the word God brought up a particular idea of him with which someone had tried to impress them during childhood. Perhaps we rejected this particular conception because it seemed inadequate. With that rejection, we imagined we had abandoned the God idea entirely. We were bothered with the thought that faith and dependence upon a power beyond ourselves was somewhat weak, even cowardly. We look upon this world of warring individuals, warring theological systems, and inexplicable calamity with deep skepticism. We looked askance at many individuals who claimed to be godly. How could a supreme being have anything to do with it all? And who could comprehend a supreme being anyhow? Yet in other moments, we found ourselves thinking, when enchanted by a starlit night, who then made all this? There was a feeling of awe and wonder, but it was fleeting and soon lost. Yes, we of agnostic temperament have had these thoughts and experiences. Let us make haste to reassure you. We found that as soon as we were able to lay aside prejudice and expressed even a willingness to believe in a power greater than ourselves, we commenced to get results, even though it was impossible for any of us to fully define or comprehend that power, which is God. And I have a few things to say about this. Um, I my sponsor says that the pain of staying the same has to become greater than the pain of changing. And some people love to run around. They're talking about being judgmental, right? Oh, how can there be a God? Look at all this awful stuff. And I want to be right, and I want to have a reason why I'm not going to follow your way of life. And what I often tell people is you don't have a problem with God, you're just picking the wrong one. You're picking yourself or you're picking alcohol, right? Those are the gods that you're picking. And if those keep working, I'm not going to be open. So that's why step one is so, so important. And when people have a problem with this, I tell them, are you thorough in your step one? Do you still think you have some moves? Is your way still going to work? And some of you know my story, and my sponsor had me go through, up to the end of chapter 3 very slowly with a lot of writing about what was happening in my life at 14 years. This is my first big book sponsor. And I was miserable by the end of it. And I said, am I supposed to be? And she said, yes, because you need to have no place else to go but God. And it was the first time that I understood the difference. And I've always questioned the last sentence in that paragraph when it says that power, which is God. I personally wonder about that. And, I'm not a huge historian, but I do know that there was a lot of argument about these phrases and how they're used and how much they're used and which ones are used and all that stuff. So, how much do we use the G word? And I think it was Hank Parkhurst is like, Bill, you can't put, all this God stuff in there. You got to. And so he emphasized the spiritual aspect, and anytime he puts something in capitals, he's saying that's a power. And what's interesting is there's places where he puts things like the Bridge of Reason is in capitals, which we're going to hear about here in a few pages. Go ahead, Emily.
This stuff is very good stuff. I remember going through this and reading the last bit of the paragraph on 46 is we have found that as soon as we were able to lay aside prejudice and even express a willingness to believe in a power greater than ourselves, we commenced to get results even though it was impossible for any of us to fully divine or comprehend that power which is God. Yeah, I just remember when I first came in, and I now have I actually just switched sponsors. And it's funny because you mentioned step one, and she's having me write like where was I powerless and how was my life unmanageable. So like looking back at that, I'm just like, yeah, everything in my life was unmanageable, and I was definitely powerless over, alcohol and other things because, I like to replace those things and use them as like um excuses, in my life. And I'm like, oh, okay, well I can drink and or, ghost them or I'm a crappy person or something, but it makes me look back at like, well, God had to intervene in some way, shape, or form in my life because if I had not accepted this, then I'd be back to square one again. I probably wouldn't even be sitting here right now talking to you guys, but if it weren't for God's intervention and me denying it again, then I don't know where I would be, and I can just see like the change, in my life immediately. Once I came in and then I, started working the steps with my sponsor, and I could sit there and lie to you guys and say, oh, well, I was just in denial and I didn't want to, believe in something greater than myself. It was just a matter of me, being willing, and when I was ready, I was ready, and I just was not ready at that time. But just for people that think that they're, an atheist or an agnostic or whatever, how can you deny the fact that there is a God, in our lives because we are miracles, and we are sitting here today and we are able to stop drinking and using, and that's why we are sitting in this room today. And I actually heard someone in a meeting once say, "Well, I don't believe in God or anything," and we're just like, "Well, it's not religion, it's spiritual." And then they were just wanting to like argue the fact that there was not a God, and I'm like, "Well, if you don't believe in God, then why are you sitting in this room today? No one sits in these AA rooms for no reason and want to quit drinking all of a sudden. Like, it's a God, consciousness that was put within us that." We realize that there's enough, that we've had enough in our lives, and it's just like, oh, I never thought about it that way. I'm like, yeah, because you have to be open-minded. And he only had like 2 days sober or whatever, but I was just like, oh, that's interesting because it puts it back into perspective of when I first came in, and I was actually able to help him, and he actually walked out with a sponsor, and he was actually able, and willing to actually talk to somebody and get help. So that's kind of what that paragraph reminded me of, was just the willingness and being able to believe in a power greater than ourselves, because he was not willing and able to until I sat down and talked with him for like 20 minutes. I'm just like, look, you're not here on accident. God put you here for a reason, and that was a good little thing that I did, and he didn't realize that until I had said something, but that's all I had. And that's what I got out of that. So,
I forgot to mention, I point out this part of the place where it says that all you have to do is have a willingness. And I use that a lot with people because I was a
mhm.
perfectionist when I got here and I wanted to do everything perfectly. And I thought that I had to believe in and understand God in steps 2 and 3. So I kept telling people just move along with the process. The change will happen at some point, because I see that sometimes with people in step 1, sometimes with people in step 3 when they're doing 60 to 63 and they're starting to see, oh yeah, me as my own God isn't really the best idea. It's not working out. Or they don't see it until step 4. So I tell them, just there's going to be a lot of change. Let's just don't worry about being perfect on this. Just move forward with it and just be willing. That's it. And hopefully, alcohol has made you willing, right? So, go ahead.
6, bottom paragraph. Much to our relief, we discovered we did not need to consider another's conception of God. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient to make the approach and to effect a contact with him. As soon as we admitted the possible existence of a creative intelligence, the spirit of the universe underlying the totality of things began to be possessed of a new sense of power and direction, provided we took other simple steps. We found that God does not make too hard terms with those who seek him. To us, the realm of the spirit is broad, roomy, all inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding to those who earnestly seek. It is open, we believe, to all men. Yeah, I just feel like, when I came in, I didn't really have an idea or a conception of God. I just knew that it was something that had, saved me from, my drinking and pills and everything. But, this pretty much just says, he meets us where we're at. We had to start somewhere. I've been told that we only have to have faith of like a mustard seed, and it kind of grows from there. It doesn't matter if it's a group of drunks, the 12 steps, AA itself, whatever. As long as we start with some type of conception of, God, of our understanding, it kind of grows and it changes, through our sobriety and everything. But, he provides, he has direction for us, he works through sponsors, sponsees, um, everything. So he, kind of just reveals himself in time to us as long as we're willing, able, and accept, some type of guidance. Um, so yeah, that's all I have for that.
It's funny, I come at this a different way.
Mm.
For me, I could take step 2 out of the whole list and leave it over here because it's taken time. Because I guess I'm that hard-headed that I really, really need to see how my way isn't going to work before I'm even willing to consider. And literally decades of time doing that. Okay. But so yeah, so it came a different way for me. It came through, like I said, some people get it at a different time. Um, and still. It's not that I, like, necessarily approach God, it's that I turn away from myself as the power. That has been, and I've heard it called addition by subtraction. So when I
Mm,
subtract myself, then I have an opportunity to have a different experience, and when I see that I can have a different experience by removing myself as the power, then I'm more open to continuing to seek that option and turn off that channel where Elizabeth's solving everything in the world and solving your problems and thinking about and I get quieter and I slow down and then something happens, right? And if I try to do the right thing, like I said earlier, you know, it's like obstacles are removed, words are given to me, just like it says later on in the book when it talks about we relax and take it easy, the right answers come. When I do that, I'm removing myself as that power. My brain is no longer filled with Elizabeth's plans and designs. Stuff comes to me. And the more I see how that works, the more I want it. And then I
mm,
choose to turn. I choose to turn to God and say, okay, what would you do here, God? My brain's a jumble. I don't know. I've had people blowing up all around me all week. And I've kind of navigated through it like, I feel like I'm in one of those war movies where you're trying to avoid the bombs being dropped and trying to be helpful and useful and steady. And I keep having to turn to God to do that for sure. And then it says, yeah, let's see. So for me, the thing about being possessed of a new sense of power and direction, provided we took other simple steps, I was taking the steps. And when they say if you work the steps, eventually the steps work you, I love that. I started to experience that. And again, showing up, trying to do the right thing, and then getting help and getting strength and getting words, getting, inspiration. All of that happened for me because I kept trying to do what was suggested and living in the world with people and doing AA service, for example, and coming up against personalities that were challenging and the urge to react in the old way, but then turning to God and saying, help me not do that. I don't want to do that anymore. I want to be a healing, harmonizing person. How can I do that? And instead of acting in the old way. And then I did have that new sense of power and direction. And then it came, it was so cool. Let's see. And I want to point out again that earnestly seek, like that's an action. It doesn't mean we find. It's in the seeking. And that's what I've just been talking about. Going out and trying to do the right thing, living life, showing up, doing what AA says, being on all three sides of the triangle, recovery, unity, and service. Showing up for my group, showing up for AA as a whole, and trying to live these principles. And I get challenged all the time. I've had, there's someone from my home group in here who knows that there's been a lot of discord lately, and it's been challenging. And to continue to just focus on principles and try to carry them forward, it can be difficult when everyone around you is just like all over, going through whatever. It's very, very challenging. So we want to, oh, it's only 25. I can't see my clock anymore. Um, top of 47, should I read that?
yes,
Okay.
correct. Mhm.
When therefore we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception of God. This applies too to other spiritual expressions which you find in this book. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. At the start, this was all we needed to commence spiritual growth, to effect our first conscious relation with God as we understood Him. Afterward, we found ourselves accepting many things which seemed entirely out of reach. That was growth, but if we wished to grow, we had to begin somewhere. So we used our own conception, however limited it was. And and
Mm,
and for me, I'm a lazy learner. I learn when I want to or when I absolutely have to, okay? But I don't if you tell me go read this stack of books, then that's the last thing I'm going to do. I know people who have they read book after book after book. I'll read Wikipedia on my phone. I don't know why that seems different to me, but it does, okay? And I'll do it. But for me, it's just been an experience. That's all I can continue to say. Something happens and I notice it because I've slowed down enough to pay attention. And I've faced so many times when I didn't have the answers or my human resources failed me. And I had to get to that place a few times in a really painful way to look at. Some of my husband went through a relapse a few years ago, and it was extremely painful for me, especially when I didn't know he was in relapse. I just suddenly this person changed before my eyes, and my whole life was ripped out from under me, and I wondered, like, am I really that bad of a picker of a partner? Like, what's happening? I thought this guy, it was terrible, and I just kept, I would get up in the morning and go to the park and write, and that was the only time I felt. I got into two-way prayer by accident. It wasn't planned. I actually wrote stuff and said, "What do I do, God?" And then literally inspiration came. It was crazy. Um,
Mm,
yeah, it was amazing. And then what does it say? Where does it say? It seemed entirely out of reach. I've had experiences that were so confusing to me that I would call my friends. We have those friends that like tarot cards and astrology, and they know a lot of, they're kind of halfway psychic, and they have a lot of that. And I would call my friends and say, "Did this really just happen? Listen to this," right? Because I've always been very academic, logical, you know. So yeah, like I have definitely had things happen when I did earnestly seek. I prayed, I asked. I didn't know that sometimes I didn't even realize I was praying. I just didn't have an answer myself. And in those little spaces, and they say somewhere that you put the key in the lock and you turn it a little bit and then you find you can turn it some more, you know? Then I've had that where I see those things happening, and it's like, wow, oh my gosh, And that's all I got.
mm. Yeah. Yeah, see, I'm that weirdo. I like to read stacks and stacks and stacks of books. Um, I was just one of those when I first came into the rooms, I was just really willing and able to do anything possible ugh, to understand the program more. And I was desperate and I was willing. That was my very first sponsor. She was like that, and so I kind of adapted, her kind of aspect of, the program and all that. And I wanted to learn more. So I was just willing to grow my, spirituality and my program knowledge for sure. And I just like this sentence here. So we use our own conception, however limited. Ooh, sorry, it was. Yeah, I didn't really have much of a conception when I first came in, but as I said previously, I read a lot of spiritual books, and I kind of have had, an awakening of my own kind. And my God obviously can look different than everyone else's, but it's what works for me. And it just it has changed my life. And and that's what my sponsor said. Don't just don't let it deter you from anyone else's kind of conception, because I can hear people sharing in the meetings. And it's just our own conscious relation with God. It's not anyone's particular. Everyone is different, and what works for me may not work for everyone else, and that's just all that matters. That's what got me sober, and still continues to keep me sober to this day. So that just kind of made sense to me when I read this paragraph. We're all different. We all have different backgrounds, but we all have one thing in common: is we all want to stop doing our addiction. Whether it's drinking, drugging, sex, gambling, whatever it may be. But we're just all willing and able to stop and going to any length to do that on a daily basis. So that's all I had from that paragraph.
Mm. You want to read the next one? Do you want me to read
Yeah,
it?
I can't stop yawning. Okay. Middle of 47. We needed to ask ourselves but one short question. Do I now believe, or am I willing to believe, that there is power greater than myself? As soon as a man can say that he does believe or is willing to believe, we emphatically assure him that he is on his way. It has been repeatedly proven among us that upon this simple cornerstone, a wonderful, effective spiritual structure can be built. Yeah, I like this short question here. It really breaks it down, especially for a newcomer. Do I now believe, or am I willing to believe, that there is a power greater than myself? That is that step one. And then of course it reiterates it into we have to be willing and, just have that idea of, believing in a power greater than ourselves, and only through that power are we able to stop drinking, drugging, etc. And we just have to build on that. It's that cornerstone that we have to build. It's like making mud. We can't have water without dirt, and then dirt, mixes into mud, and building that, foundation, like placing stones in between that, and then, letting it stick. And, so that's kind of like with our spirituality. We have to start from something and build up, from there. So that's kind of why I like to use that demonstration with my sponsees when I go through this with my sponsees, because it just, gives them a visual for sure for that. So that's all I have for that paragraph.
Yeah, my again, like I said, I come at this a bit different way. So I
Mhm.
haven't found it necessary to need to have any kind of idea. Really, it's just turning at the addition by subtraction again. Turning away from myself as the power has given room to something to come in. But I've heard this statement: do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe, that there is a power greater than myself? I've heard speakers joke about this sentence and say it in a sarcastic way and say only alcoholics need to be asked that question, because our egos are like, I can do everything. I'm going to manage all this stuff. I can manage your life, my life, their life, So to ask that question, and it's sort of a, hmm, really? You don't think there's a power greater than you? Interesting. I think that's pretty funny when they do that. Um, and I think the willingness to believe for me was the willingness to see the truth that when I try to be the power in my life, it doesn't work enough of the time that it could be dangerous for me to have a possible return to alcohol. Because trying to be the power in my life is staying in the second half of step one, and you can do these steps backwards. And I don't want to end up at the first half of step one. So I have to, be often reminded, um, and I hit the wall enough times that I have gotten to the place where I do turn and I say, "Here I am, God, ready. What I'm ready to do your will. What is it?" And I do that throughout the day. But it took a long, long time to see any of that, to see that I was, as they say, God can't fill a cup that's already full, and I was already full, and I didn't know it. I just didn't understand, and my ego didn't let me see that I was missing anything. So, let me read the next one. Let's see. That was great news to us. For we have, oh, wait a minute, sorry. A wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. I spoke at a meeting yesterday that their format was what happened and what made it click for you. They said, what made it
Mm.
click for you? And that's what I've been talking about. When I stop being the power in my life, something seems to help me. When I try to show up and do what AA suggests, be nice to the person that's mean to you, for example, is the example I use a lot. Something happens. I am given aid. I am given power. My heart softens towards that person. Then I'm with my God. I am with God. I'm in the world of the spirit. I'm living a spiritual and walking a spiritual path when I do that. And I am aided on that path. I'm not aided on the other path, although I will be the last person to see that, right? So that is the structure for me, is to turn and say, here I am. And I always tell people that my program is parked at the top of 63. That is my favorite little part of the book. And it's the simplest. And it's when we stay close to him and perform his work well, he gives us everything we need. And I said it backwards, but yeah. So what's his will? How do I stay close to him? I turn all day long. And that's the structure, right? For me, it is. For me. I can't speak for anyone else. Okay, next paragraph, bottom of 47. This was great news to us, for we assumed we could not make use of spiritual principles unless we accepted many things on faith which seemed difficult to believe. When people presented us with spiritual approaches, how frequently did we all say, I wish I had what that man has. I'm sure it would work if I could only believe as he believes, but I cannot accept as surely true the many articles of faith which are so plain to him. So it was comforting to learn that we could commence at a simpler level. Besides a seeming inability to accept much on faith. Wait a minute. Okay. And they reference the spiritual appendix again, but I think, have we read that in this group, or should we read it? We've read it, all right. Sorry. Besides the seeming inability to accept much on faith, we often found ourselves handicapped by obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasoning prejudice. Many of us have been so touchy that even casual reference to spiritual things made us bristle with antagonism. This sort of thinking had to be abandoned. Though some of us resisted, we found no great difficulty in casting aside such feelings. Faced with alcoholic destruction, we soon became as open minded on spiritual matters as we tried to be on other questions. In this respect, alcohol was a great persuader. It finally beat us into a state of reasonableness. Sometimes this was a tedious process. We hope no one else will be prejudiced for as long as some of us were. And I can really, really identify with this. My home group is a newcomers meeting. How many people do we get that come into AA and they're like, oh, but the God thing, and they just, and it's like, hey, you know what? I always tell them, you're still in step one, right? You need to do a thorough step one and see, do you need our way of life? You may not, you may find that you're not an alcoholic and that you can control your drinking. You know, we can't help you until you find out that you need help, that you have a desire to stop. We had a guy in our come and talk about his 3 to 6 month reduction plan, and he was trying to find out how we could help him with that. I'm like, we don't have a moderation plan here. If you are a heavy drinker or habitual drinker that doesn't have alcoholism, possibly you can do that. But if you find that you're an alcoholic who can't control his drinking and then you have a desire to stop, AA has something for you, right? And I think about the book was written for a lot of low bottom drunks. They've already tried everything, been to hospitals, institutions, doctors, they've lost everything. And, raising that bottom for people who haven't, to say, look, and that's what happened for me, right? I got by with half measures, not even half, for a long time. And I don't believe I could do that today because experience has shown me that in the past 5 years, for example, and I see that it is progressive and that the pain of not doing this is so great. Like it gets worse if you don't work a program. I know people like that are around 4 or 5 years. I remember being there and it's like, oh, I got inventory to write, but you put it off. It's there, but you put it off. I can't do that anymore. Like literally can't live with it. The pain is too much, and I don't know if that's because I'm further away from a drink. I've heard people say that, but I didn't have the alcoholic destruction that some had. Like I said, it came for me much later to look at, the fact that I was 14 years sober, my car got repossessed, my electricity got turned off because I was so focused on making a relationship work, a romantic relationship that wasn't working, that was very toxic, that my whole life was falling apart. That's when I became teachable. That's when I started looking for help and found a sponsor who would tell me what to do and I would listen to her, right? And that's when I became open-minded. I wasn't open-minded before that. I picked people who wouldn't tell me what to do. I was in self-help, right?
Mm.
Did I stay dry? Yeah, I did, you know? So some people can, but then there's a point where, nope, I have this deadly disease and I'm at risk of going back if I don't look at this and say, hey, maybe this is going to work for me because my other ways aren't working or they're not working enough of the time, you know, that I could be in danger of that suddenly we talked about on page 36 because I'm not expanding and perfecting my spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice. We go back in self so fast around here. I can do it. I mean, I can do it 10 times a day. Poor me. Like just what I talked about, all the drama around me this week, poor Elizabeth, and I did, and it was tough. I got this proper support and I did a 10 step and I moved on, but thank God I needed to because I can't stay in those places anymore. Literally can't. Too painful. Go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, I like on 47, in the middle of the paragraph it says, I wish what that man has, I'm sure it would work if I could only believe as he believes. Um, that was definitely my experience, when I first found my first sponsor. And I like what she had. And I was told at the beginning that, just believe, if you believe I believe, then that is something that you can start with your conception of God, and it just kind of grew from there. But I believe that she believed, because she now has like 32 years sober. So I definitely knew that she believed something, and that helped me for a while there until I found my own conception. And then the sort of thinking that had to be abandoned, it was the sort of thinking that I could still like run my life without a power greater than myself. I had to smash that because I'm not able to run my own life. I had tried time and time again that I was able to, and I was just never successful. So I had to be desperate and willing enough to get out of myself and ask a God of my understanding um for help. um it says in this respect alcohol was a great persuader. Yeah, that kind of ran my life for like 20 something years. I thought, okay, maybe I would just moderate and you know, run my life the way I want without running it into the ground, until I ran it into the ground and I had nothing when I first came in. I had to be hurt enough to know that I needed help, and I had to be desperate enough to ask for help, and that's kind of where I am. And that's kind of what I have to tell my sponsees. Like, you have to be sick and tired of being sick and tired. I had absolutely nothing when I came in, and then I gained everything when I got sober and sticked around. I sponsor a lot of people that are like me as well, and you just kind of have to tell them how you surrendered and how desperate you were to believe, because otherwise they won't understand that process. And then
Can we
sometimes
open
this.
it up?
Yeah, 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 yeah. We'll open it up. I'll stop the recording. Give me 1 second.